Okay. When you talk about Judaism and Jewish symbols, it's very interesting that the Ten Commandments says that God has no image, right? You're not allowed to make any image of God. And that seems to be a very important principle in Judaism. Yet, when you think about the temple in Jerusalem, in Israel, that the Torah tells us to build, and the Jewish people first built in the desert, and then they built in the temple, first in the desert, then Temple Mountain in Israel. Welcome. So here you start thinking about symbolism, and I guess there are some images there, which we have to understand what they're doing there, and how that does not contradict the idea of not having any images. In the temple, you think about the temple, the most inner chamber, the most spiritual part of the temple, the holiest part of the temple, where only Aaron, the high priest, or subsequently the other high priests, only one person, representative of all the Jewish people, is allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, and only once a year on Yom Kippur. So it's only the holiest day, maybe the holiest person within Judaism, and the holiest space. And what happens when you go into the Holy of Holies? What do you see? So you see the Ark. The Ark is a gold box that contains the tablets, the Torah. Okay. But then on top of the Ark is what they call the cherubim. And the cherubim, no one's 100% sure what cherubim means. Now cherub it's in the Torah, so it's Hebrew. It becomes a word for angels, because there's sort of two angelic figures. Rashi, that was a good question, Rina. Rashi says, what's cherubim? Rashi says it's related to the Aramaic word. Kiravia, Ravia is child. So there's face of children. So there are different interpretations. But the bottom line is, when you walk into the temple, when you walk into the Holy of Holies, you see the Ark. On the Ark, you see the covering. The covering is a piece of gold with two golden images of young children or angels extending out of the cover, and they have wings, and the wings cover the Ark. Right? I'm sure you saw the picture of the Ark. Now the question is, what does that represent, and how does that contradict the fact that you're not supposed to have any images for Hashem? So that's a wonderful question. I don't know if we should get into that right now.
Another question.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the Torah, at the mezuzah, which are very holy,
Yeah.
in fact, they are so important that we have to encounter every day, even many times.
Right.
And in order to integrate and become one.
Right.
And this is holy, and holy is just the opposite.
Right.
So there is a contrast here, which
You're saying that concept of, I think what you're saying is that concept of the
holiness is, you should basically, in order to integrate it, become part of it.
right.
You should become more familiar in order to appreciate it, rather to here the attitude is the opposite.
So that's a good discussion. That's a good discussion of whether or not holiness is supposed to be, in what way is it supposed to be familiar, and in what way it's supposed to be separated and apart and sacred. So that's a good discussion. That's a good discussion. That's a little beyond our discussion right now, but it's a good discussion. So I want to start from a piece of Talmud. And the piece of Talmud describes, and it's apropos for the time we're reading, because we're reading 2 days before the 9th of Av, where we celebrate the destruction of the temple. So the Talmud here has a piece that tells you that the Gentiles who came into the temple to destroy the temple were actually quite surprised to see that the most sacred place of the Jewish people, there's two cherubim. Why? Because the cherubim, according to the tradition, is really not just two faces of two people, but also one male, one female. So in some sense, the cherubim is I don't want to say erotic, but it represents the love of man and woman. And that's the holiest place within Judaism. And the Talmud says that the Gentiles actually found that a little bit surprising. So I'm going to share the screen, which I forgot to do, and we'll read some of the text. We'll start with the Talmud. The Jews find that surprising? That's a good question. That's a good question. Do we find that surprising? So yeah, it's a little surprising. But I'm going to read the Talmud. What am I going to tell you? I'm just going to read the sources. Rav Katina said, so this is Talmud tractate Yoma which discusses the service of the temple on Yom Kippur. So prominent part of the service on Yom Kippur is entering the Holy of Holies and the service that the high priest does in the Holy of Holies. So part of that discussion, we talk about, well, what if it was in the Holy of Holies? Discussion there, the first temple, the second temple, because the second temple, the Cherubim weren't there. So we're not going to get into too much detail here between the two temples, because we get into a little bit over here in the comments, but we'll try our best to stay simple. Rav Katina said, when the Jewish people would ascend to one of the pilgrimage festivals, the priests would roll up the curtain for them and show them the cherubs, which were clinging to one another, and say to them, see how you are beloved before God like the love of male and female. The two cherubs symbolize the Holy One, blessed be He, and the Jewish people. Okay, what's not in the bold, I take no responsibility for. That's the commentary, not the Talmud. So this is where the Jews surprised. Your point, John. And the idea is, no, they shouldn't be surprised, because every holiday they would actually open up all the gates. The Israelites are not allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, but presumably they would open up the curtains, and everybody could see the ark. And the point is to show the people that this symbolism of male and female, the love between male and female, is a symbolism of the love of God and the Jewish people. So to your point, the Jews were not surprised. Maybe it's surprising, but we got used to it.
Well, an important point here is that one of the most sacred commandments is love your God with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your heart.
Right.
So how is one person know how to love God? Because you need to have something to relate comparison.
Yes.
So the greatest love one has is basically to your spouse.
Right. So that's a metaphor.
Another human being.
Yeah.
So basically to connect how to love your God.
Yeah. So I want to talk about that for a moment, because let's finish the point. Let's finish the point and we'll go back to that. Reish Lakish said, when Gentiles destroyed the second temple and entered the sanctuary. Okay. I should skip. I'm only going to read the bold, because the other things, it's going to get a little complicated. Reish Lakish said, when Gentiles entered the sanctuary, they saw cherubs clinging to one another. They took them out to the market and said, these Jews, whose blessing is a blessing and whose curse is a curse, meaning to say that whatever they say happens because they're close to God, they be occupied with such matters, making images of this kind, ? Right? So that represents the point that, yes, it maybe Jews are used to it, because if you look at the Bible, certainly in the later books of the Bible, certainly in the prophets, Song of Songs, you do have the metaphor of male and female, for the love of male and female, for the relationship between God and the Jewish people. So we're not totally surprised. But if somebody who's not in that culture, it doesn't seem spiritual, it doesn't seem holy, and it doesn't seem appropriate to be placed in the most holy place. So that is a little bit, there's just a piece of Talmud just to get us in to the discussion, and to get us into the point of also by the time of the year we're in. So that's good as well. Okay, so there are many forms of bond that you could find within people, right? You can find sort of a connection between parents and children, between friends. There are many metaphors. And indeed, the Bible has multiple metaphors. And if you look at the 5 books of Moses specifically, almost never is there the male-female relationship, almost never. You usually have, what do you have between the metaphor for God and the Jewish people? You have the metaphor of parents and children. So Moses says in Deuteronomy, you are the sons of Hashem. God says, Israel, you have a shepherd, not a
patronizing.
I'm talking about the 5 books of Moses. I don't know that it says that God is the shepherd. I don't know that it says it explicitly. You have the images of Moses and the sheep, but primarily it's the relationship of parents and children. And you have, God says in Egypt, when first time he speaks to Moshe, B'ni B'chori Yisrael, Israel is my firstborn child, etc., etc. That's the metaphor. Later on in Jewish history, we start developing another metaphor, and the metaphor is spouse and love between male and female, and it's culminated by some of the prophets, Isaiah and others, culminated with the Song of Songs, which is basically a romantic tale between male and female, which represents the love between God and the Jewish people. But it's also, actually, the point here is, it goes back to the Torah itself, because this is the cherubim, at least the way the rabbis read it. When you go into the holiest place in Judaism, what are you seeing? You're seeing the connection between male and female as a metaphor for the relationship between God and the Jewish people.
I see this different.
Go ahead.
I see this as God loving the children as men and women. God loves man and God loves woman the same.
Right.
And that they're equal, and it has nothing to do, and this man took his own mind and put his own thought on it and said, this is how it's supposed to be.
Understood.
Sexual connotation, but it really isn't. It's God saying, I love each, they're both equal, they're both the same.
That's certainly a valid interpretation.
And then this people, this Reish Lakish.
Even before Ishak, Rav Katina.
He brought that on
Okay.
by our interpretation.
So we're going to stand behind it. We're going to believe that the Jewish people believe based on Isaiah and based on.
I believe he said that we're equal.
Your
and
perspective.
I love both men and women.
That's a valid perspective. I don't want
I'm
to.
not trying to be argumentative.
That's a valid perspective. I will give you the traditional perspective, which is that one of the forms of the relationship between God and the Jewish people is the form of romantic relationship between male and female. And the point what we're going to try to get to, what I'm trying to get to is that the relationship between God and the people in the form of romantic relationship reflects our own relationship, our own romantic relationships, and hopefully we'll take that to other relationships as well. So that's the roadmap.
Yeah, I disagree that God loves equally.
Okay, I don't want
God loves differently. Every love is holy because the man and woman have different attributes. So they are endowed these different qualities, and the important thing to use these qualities for God's sake. So the concept of equality is.
Okay, I don't want to get into that right now. It's beyond the scope. It's beyond the scope. The first thing I want to talk about is relationships. Is that people sense that relationships is a very deep part of the human psyche. In other words, it's very important for people to connect. All forms of relationship. I'm not specifically talking about romantic relationships. I'm talking about relationships in general. Friends, children, spouses, colleagues, whatever it is. A person naturally feels the need to connect and the need to transcend and connect to other people. From the Kabbalistic perspective, that is not an accident. Why is that not an accident? Because the concept of a relationship is embedded in all of creation. In fact, it's the purpose of creation. So if you go back and ask the most fundamental question, why did God create the universe? Most fundamental question. Now, that's a question that all Jewish thinkers ask, thinkers in general ask, but Jewish thinkers ask as well. And they give all different answers, and they formulate the answer in different ways. But in some sense, the most fundamental concept of that would be that what is God missing before he creates the universe? And now it's a tricky question, because if you say he's missing something, then he's imperfect, and God cannot be imperfect. That's an axiom. Okay. So what is God missing? So essentially nothing. But the one thing we give him, creation, forget about we as individual, creation gives him is something outside himself to relate to. So John says company. I'm going to call it relationships.
Yeah.
And the Zohar, that you look at the different Kabbalistic works, everyone's saying the same thing in different ideas. So for example, one place in Kabbalah, it says, why does God create the world? So there should be someone to know him. Why does God create the world? Because God is kind. And you know what? If you could be the kindest person in the universe, if you're the only person on an island of kindness, you have no one to share your kindness with, you have no one to express the kindness with, then it's you're not really, I mean, you're kind, but it doesn't express itself. So in other words, what we're trying to get at, the first big idea is that the essential purpose of the universe is essentially because God, like it says in the Torah, in Genesis, it says it is not good for man to be alone. And it's very interesting, because if you look at the 6 days of creation, it also says it's good. The first not good is loneliness. Now, it doesn't mean loneliness never has a space. People have both a need to be within themselves and a need to relate, just like within God. Within God also, there's God's essence is concealed from us, but some of it is revealed. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that according to the Kabbalah, the fact that the human nature is that one seeks to connect. It's not an accident. It's not just evolution. It's the idea. It actually comes from a spiritual source. And again, this is based on the premise that our relationships reflect the essential relationship, which is God and the universe, God and the people, God and the Jewish people, call it any way you want.
See,
So that's
that
big
proves
idea
the
number one.
point,
Go ahead. Yeah.
that it was not a,
Romantic,
it's not a that was not, none of that was romantic. like you
there's
said. It's friendship, it's kindness. We want.
all good.
That's a separate.
What I am saying is, and again, there are multiple forms of relationship, and our relationship with God has multiple angles. And therefore, on the Yom Kippur is a beautiful song. And the song says, Ki anu amecha, and it lists all the metaphors of the relationship between God and the Jewish people. He is our shepherd, we are his sheep. He is our father, we are his children. We're the vineyard, he's the planter, etc., etc., etc. And we say it multiple times. One of them, we are his beloved, he is our lover. It goes both ways. And if you look at the words of the prophets, again, the fact of the matter is that all throughout certainly the prophets, you would see this metaphor. And what I'm trying to say is that the Kabbalah is trying to say is that all of these forms of connection in our life, essentially, everything comes from a deeper spiritual truth. And the deeper spiritual truth is that is one aspect of our relationship between God and the Jewish people. And the human soul just reflects that aspect of the relationship with God. And then once we understand that, we can start thinking about different forms of relationship. We'll start with romantic relationship. We're not going to end there. We'll talk about other forms of relationship as well. And then, like I said, if we have time, we go back to the Kabbalistic tools that we had last week and try to figure out how that will help us in a practical form to help us advance in all relationships. So that's the roadmap. Correct.
Multidimensional spiritual.
Correct. And each metaphor each metaphor
depends on the different people. They can connect on a different way.
Connects to different people and also different times within every person's day or life, different aspects. Each metaphor has an advantage and a disadvantage. We can start going into them right now, but that's not the place or time. Okay, now I'm going to give you a surprising Kabbalistic text. I'll be honest with you, when I read it, this is from the author of the Tanya, the founder of the Chabad philosophy, Chabad movement. And I'll be honest, when I read it for the first time, I was surprised. And essentially what he's saying here is that let's go back for a second. The Kabbalah says something very interesting. If you look back, we don't have all the texts here. The Kabbalah would say like this: if you look back at the story of creation, certainly if you look back at the way the sages read the story of creation, you read the verses. The first time it says God created man, what does it say? God created Adam, male and female, he created them. That's Genesis chapter 1. So Adam, male and female, created them. So it's 1 or it's 2. You don't know. Then you look at Genesis number 2, and that's Genesis chapter 2, and that's the more famous story. The more famous story is that man was alone, and God puts him to sleep and takes a side and creates Eve. That's the more known story. But before that story, it says that God created Adam, male and female, created them. So the sages read that and they say, you know what? Essentially, it seems that when he first creates them, they are one. Somehow they separate. Now, how do you want to read that? We'll get to that later. But we're going to start from a spiritual perspective. And the point here is that essentially male and female are two halves of one soul, and they separate, and then they come back to each other. What Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, the joy of the reunion, the attraction, the desire to connect is not just biological, it's not just physical, but it's essentially the soul looking to connect to, I don't know if it's the other half, a part of itself. So let's read it inside. Number 2, if a person did not see a close friend for a long time, upon reunion, the love and joy will burn with great intensity. However, had they not been separated for so long, the love and joy of reunion would not be as great. In other words, in some sense, the longer you're separated, the greater the longing in some way. Yet, the intensity of love upon reunion is relative to their attachment before they separated. If their attachment were very strong, then the pain of their separation would be very great. And the greater the pain upon separation, the stronger the love and joy upon reunion. So it works both ways. In other words, if you separate from somebody for a long and distant separation, that creates longing. But only if you were very deeply connected to that person. If you see the person once and then they separate, big deal, right? Here, the point is you have the extremes. On one hand, you were very close. Then you separated, that creates great longing. And therefore the reunion, the joy of the reunion is greater. Likewise, regarding the joy of bride and groom, before being placed into bodies, their souls were united with the ultimate spiritual closeness. But once placed into separate bodies, the souls are completely separated for a long time. Then when they come together at the time of the wedding, under the chuppah, there is great joy since they were separated for so long. This is the primary reason for the joy of the bride and groom. In other words, the way the separation creates longing and therefore creates joy upon reunion, the way that works is if you're very, very deeply connected and then you're separated, then you have this desire to connect. And then when you do connect, then the joy is intensified. And what he's saying is that starts with the two souls. The souls are essentially one, so they're very deeply connected. Then they separate. And once they separate, there's this long separation, but that creates the longing and that creates a desire to connect. And therefore, upon reunion, the connection happens. So again, what we're trying to say is that why do people want to enter romantic relationships? So everybody has their own reasons, and but from the scientific perspective, it's almost like it's just very biological. It's just nature playing a trick. Nature wants to procreate, so it plays a trick on you and convinces you that you're in love, and that's the reason for the attraction. But spiritually, we say that's not the whole story. Maybe part of the story, but that's not the whole story. It starts in a much deeper place. It starts from a soul wanting to connect to the other half of the soul. So that's a little bit about romantic relationships. We're going to draw this out to all relationships and then come back to specific tools. So what is the most important thing a person has to, I don't want to say the most important thing. What is a very important thing about any type of relationship, and how to, and if I bring more of that into my life, I'm able to advance in any of my relationships. So a very important point is to think about the concept of what the Torah says to love your fellow as yourself. Okay, love your fellow as yourself. Now, that's a very radical statement. And in fact, many people say it is impossible. Impossible to love your fellow as yourself. In other words, many Jewish commentaries say it's impossible to love your fellow as yourself because you're yourself, there's somebody else. Your fellow, you'll never love your fellow as yourself. They therefore say what the Torah means to say is not love your fellow as yourself, but treat your fellow the way you want to be treated. Right? That's different than love your fellow as yourself. It's more technical. Treat your fellow the way you want to be treated. So that's one perspective. But then you come to the Kabbalistic perspective, and the Kabbalistic perspective asks a simple question: could you love your fellow as yourself? And the answer is it depends. It depends. It depends. How do you view yourself and how do you view the other person? And essentially what we're going to say is as follows. If you view yourself and you relate to and you connect to your spiritual side, in other words, your soul, and you look at another person and you look at them primarily as a soul, so then you can love your fellow as yourself. That can be true love, because true love would mean because the soul level we're connected. If I primarily look at myself as a physical entity, and I primarily look at you as a physical entity, then we can have all kinds of arrangements. We can have all kinds of transactions that are win-win, but ultimately you cannot have ultimate love of really connecting to the other person as yourself, because you're not the self. So this goes back. You're not one. You. The other person is not you. From the body perspective, the other person is not you, and they will never be you. And you can never love your fellow as yourself. And that's why, from the bodily perspective, the sages say you really can't do it. So you know what? Treat the other person like you want to be treated. Okay, that we can understand. That we could do. But that's only if you're looking from the body perspective. From the soul perspective, ultimately you are able to love your fellow as yourself because from the soul level, we all people are one. Now, this explains a very important statement that the Talmud says. The Talmud says the statement that Hillel, There's a story. The Gentile wanted to convert, and he comes to Hillel. Everyone knows, perhaps you know the story. Gentile wants to convert, and he comes to Hillel. And first he goes to Shammai, and he says, "Teach me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot." And Shammai throws him out of the house with the stick, with the broomstick, or the measuring stick. And he goes to Hillel, and Hillel says, he gets onto his 1 foot. Hillel says, "What is hateful to you, don't do to others." This is the whole Torah. Everything else is commentary. Now, it's a very beautiful story. I tell it to the kids all the time. Very nice story. But the question is it really true? Love your fellow as yourself is one of the 613 commandments. Maybe it's an important one. Maybe it's general. Maybe it includes others. But you're going to say it is the whole entire Torah? Like, what does eating matzah on Passover have to do with loving your fellow as yourself? What does fasting on Yom Kippur have to do with loving your fellow as yourself? So the Kabbalistic answer is as follows. The Kabbalistic answer is to love your fellow as yourself is impossible unless you identify with your soul. And when you see somebody else, you primarily identify them as their soul. The whole purpose of the Torah is to get you in touch with your own soul. So why do I fast on Yom Kippur? Why do I eat matzah on Passover? Why do I put on tefillin? Why do I light Shabbos candles? It's all to make the spirit more primary in my life. Now, the more the spiritual is primary in my life, the more I can love somebody, because the more I can connect to that person and therefore love them. Otherwise, it's a relationship, it's mutual beneficial, it's all good, but it's not ultimately comes back to self, which is the danger of love. Love always comes back to self. Love, in some sense, if it's not a spiritual level, love is all very selfish. As the famous story goes, that a guy walks into a fish restaurant and the waiter says, "What do you want to eat?" And he says, "I love fish. Can I eat fish?" And the waiter says, "Happy to give you fish, but you don't love fish. If you love the fish, you would leave the fish in the sea. You love yourself. You like the way fish makes you feel. So you love to say you're eating the fish." In other words, love could be selfish, but essentially when the Torah says love, we don't mean that selfish love. We mean to be able to sense, to connect to the other person, because that other person and you are one, and therefore it's not about you. It's about seeing the soul connection between that other person. And this is not, it's true about romantic relationships. It's true, as we said in number 2, there's literally 2 halves of one soul. But as we'll see in section 4, I skipped 3, we'll get to 3 in a second. But section 4 is that it's true about any relationship, the commandment with any person. The commandment to love your fellow as yourself is applicable to every person. So let me just read 3 and 4 very quickly, because they're important, and then we'll take any questions, and we'll see where we want to go from there. I'm quoting from the Ethics of the Fathers. Ethics of the Fathers, number 3 says as follows: any love that is dependent on something, when the thing ceases, the love also ceases. But a love that is not dependent on anything never ceases. And then we continue the examples. The point is, why do you love me? Why do I love you? If the reason is there is something, if there's a reason, then you say, well, it's a nice thing, but it may not last. Ultimately, true love, if it's not dependent on anything, it never ceases. So what does it mean if it's not dependent? Why do I love you? So now we're going to get to the point. Can you go deeper than a reason? And deeper than a reason, we'll read text 4, and then we'll read the chart on text 5, and we'll read the chart, which is interesting, and we'll see if we can get through it. But first, we'll take a question. So I'm reading text 4, which is, again, from the Tanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, about the mitzvah to love your fellow as yourself. Hence, in the case of those who give major consideration to their bodies, while regarding their souls as secondary, of secondary importance, there can be no true love and brotherhood among them. In other words, yeah, you can be a friend, but it will be, I'm your friend because I gained something out of it. Right? So in other words, you can have the idea, if I'm primarily my body and my soul is secondary, I cannot have true love. Yeah, I can have a lot of friends, a lot of Facebook friends, a lot of friends, but it's all dependent on something. Why am I a friend? Because I get something out of it, because it makes me feel good, etc. Right? But only a love which is dependent on a transitory thing. In other words, but if I connect to my soul, if my soul is the primary and my body is secondary, of course I have a body. Of course I'm physical. There's a physical component to my life. But if that's not the primary part of my life, then I can have true love. This is what Hillel the elder meant when he said in regard to the fulfillment of this commandment. This is the whole Torah. The rest is but commentary. For the basis and root of the entire Torah is to raise and exalt the soul high above the body. Tanya chapter 32. In other words, how can Hillel say that love your fellow as yourself is the entire Torah? Because what is the essence? How could you love your fellow as yourself? Only if in your life your soul is primary. And therefore, when you look at yourself and somebody else, you see their soul. I don't love you because of something physical or tangible that is transitory, that could remain, that could change. We'll see in a minute. You can have that as well. but that's not the primary reason. Ultimately, the love becomes love that is not dependent on anything, and not because meaning anything physical, and not because when it comes to the level of the soul, we are one. Now, if we had time, really, we could sit on this chart for an hour. What we have here is what the Kabbalah calls, it's based on the Medrash, the 5 levels of the soul. That's on the top box. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida. So we have the description of what that would look like in relationships. In other words, the Nefesh is the biological, Ruach is emotional, Neshama is intellectual, Chaya is spiritual, Yechida is the essence, unity. So we talk about the description of how that aspect would connect in the physical relationship, and then the consequence. So if you can go through this for a minute, and what we're trying to say here is not that on the left column, that sort of the left side of the chart is not important. It's very important to connect on all levels. But the question is, what is primary and what is secondary? And the question is, what part of my relationship needs to be strengthened, right? Sometimes I could think about, I have one aspect, but not the other. So this is something to think about when we think about all relationships. There could be romantic, here they put it out as romantic relationships, but it's true in all relationships. So what we see here, Nefesh is biological. So let's go to the middle box, not the description, but the basis. You have body, heart, mind, soul, and essence. Another way of saying biological, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and unity. So if you want to think about one aspect of that, so the biological would be physical attraction to physical features. The emotional would be emotional bond and compatibility. Neshama would be intellectual compatibility. Spiritual compatibility of conviction, visions, and beliefs. And then ultimate is total unity, both halves of one entity. And then you talk about what the consequences, how permanent would a relationship be if it's the expression of primarily one of these levels. Now, the argument is not that some of these are not important. All of them are important. But in other words, the question is, if the foundation of the relationship is specifically biological, then it's no surprise that it's going to change, even if it's emotional, right? The more you get to the spiritual side, the more you're connecting on the right side of this chart, the more you're getting to the spiritual component, the deeper that would play out, if you see what I'm saying. The deeper the relationship would play out. Now, this is a chart you could take it home, and you could think about it, and you could think about it in all aspects of your relationship. Let's say you have a friend or a child. So what are you doing? Are you connecting on a physical level? Are you playing baseball together? Are you going to drinks together? Are you connecting on an emotional level? Are you connecting on a spiritual level? Right? I have different friends for different things. Sometimes when I have an idea, I can't call the other friend because he doesn't care about ideas. Right? So if you want to connect on the level of neshama, intellectual, so you have to have that type of friend. And they're different. Again, this is just a roadmap of tracking about our soul with these 5 components, which we can elaborate upon what they are. That could be another class, but how those 5 components play out in our relationships. Okay, we'll take a break here for a few seconds. If anyone has any comments or questions, after this we move to things that are maybe a little bit more practical. Maybe, I don't know. Go ahead.
I want to quote Rabbi Shlomo Risky.
Yeah.
Back you up.
Yeah. Thank you.
He basically says that whenever it says love your fellow man as yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Always is followed by I'm the Lord.
Ani Hashem. Yeah.
I'm the Lord. So they say the reason for that is, like you said, that the love is never supposed to be on the physical.
Only physical, right?
But it has to be seen through that,
right?
Through the spiritual perspective. So if you look through the spiritual perspective, it doesn't even have to be equal, because you can be very sophisticated spiritually, and the other person can be very, primitive spiritually. So there is no equality, but there is understanding, empathy, and compassion.
Yeah. Correct.
So, and respect, the important thing that you have the holiness which exists in every person. So the idea is the love you person. She said, well, you know, I have so much money, I give you half because I love.
Right.
So that's completely misunderstood.
Yes, that
So
would,
it has to be understood through I'm the Lord.
yes,
Through
that's
the.
great. That's
through-
great.
So anyway, so
Great
that-
stuff.
That can back.
Yes, thank you,
Whatever you said.
thank you,
Another.
thank you.
Why
Oh.
didn't perspective, rabbi perspective.
Okay. We're gonna move to something, things that are a little bit more practical and based on the Kabbalistic tools, but we'll start with a concept that seems very esoteric, but it's not esoteric at all, as we'll see. So what did we say so far? We said that essentially a relationship, if you get to the soul level, a relationship is, romantic relationship, but any relationship is, that on the soul level, we're one. But there's a little bit, that becomes a little bit dangerous, and we'll see why. That could be dangerous, we'll see why. So I'm going to quote from the Zohar. You may have heard the Zohar, but we'll quote the Zohar. It says the Zohar as follows. This is the last text we have here, and then we'll try to make it practical. Our masters taught that Adam and Eve were created back to back. That's what the Medrash says. The Medrash says that, quoting the verse that I said earlier, God created man. Sorry, bad translation. God created Adam. Male and female created them. So was it Adam in the singular, or was it male and female? So the Medrash says that at first God creates one entity that's male and female back to back. They were not created, so they're attached back to back. Then Genesis 2, where you read about how God says it's not good for Adam to be alone. God says it separates the two, brings them together. That is the next step, says the Zohar. Why were they not created face to face? Because above as well, heaven and earth were back to back. As it says, the infinite God had not brought rain upon the earth. Why was there no rain? For there was no Adam, meaning the higher world has not yet been repaired. But once the lower world was repaired, because Adam and Eve united face to face, then the higher world was also repaired. Now there was a complete Adam above and below. That's the Zohar. Now, when you read the Zohar, it's going to be cryptic. So don't be surprised that you don't understand everything exactly as it says here. I'll give you a little bit of hope to try to give a little bit of background, and then everything makes sense and everything becomes very, very practical. What the Zohar is saying is there's two forms of a relationship. There could be a back-to-back relationship. There could be a face-to-face relationship. In the beginning, you have a back-to-back relationship, which is not the ultimate. You can be in a relationship which is back-to-back, and you are lonely. Man is alone, even though technically it's male and female. Man is still alone. For man to have a proper relationship, there has to be separation, not back-to-back. According to the Zohar, there's a Nasira, there's literally a surgery. Nasira literally means to shave down, in other words, to cut and separate these two entities. And then when you're separated, ironically, when you're separated, you could be face to face. But what is the Zohar saying? So there are different ways of explaining it. I'm going to try to make it practical. Practical is like this. You could be in a relationship with somebody, but it's back to back. What happens when someone is back to back? You don't really see them. Again, any relationship, it could be children, it could be any relationship, romantic also, certainly. What does back-to-back mean? You don't really see them, but the other person is there. Yeah, but they're an extension of me. They're here for how that plays out to me. I want to go out with you. I want to have dinner with you because of how that makes me feel, because then I need someone to laugh at my jokes. So I call you up and say, would you like to go and have dinner with me? So in that sense, you can have a wonderful relationship, and the food was good, and the dessert was wonderful, and everyone had a good time. But in my psyche, ultimately, from my perspective, it's all about an extension of me. Now my existence now expresses itself in that way, and could be a lot of fun, perhaps. But what the Zohar is going to say, ultimately, that's loneliness. Because a true relationship, even though we are one, that's the key here. Even though we are one, a true relationship has to be, you have to separate the people. And ironically, when you separate the person, and when you view the person as somebody else and someone distinct and different from yourself, then, and only then, you can have a face-to-face relationship. Face-to-face relationship means I'm connecting to you on your terms. I want to know your perspective, and I understand that your perspective may be different than my perspective. And essentially, that is something that, especially when people fall in love, it's very difficult for many people to do, because they're two opposite emotions. Love is connection. And connection is, I want to feel one with you. So if I like this, what do I want to do? I want you to like this. not because I'm selfish, because I want to feel one, right? I like chocolate ice cream. You're not going to like chocolate ice cream. How could that be? I love it so much. Here, taste it. You don't like it. But if I want to feel one with you, I want to connect and I want to superimpose my personality upon you, and not because it's not coming from a bad place. It's coming from a good place. It's coming from a desire to connect. The problem is that the desire to connect in that sense is what the Kabbalah would call back to back.
If you really want to connect with somebody, it's mostly.
Yeah.
You have to. Understand their needs.
Yes.
That's true love.
Yeah.
Not.
Agreed.
You can make your statement, I feel this way, but true love.
Agreed.
Soul love. Is, and that grows, sometimes you have to meet the person on the physical and the other stuff. And that, when you see them, then the soul love, Hashem wants it to happen, to see each other. And then you want to understand the other person and do what the other person needs. That is more love.
Correct.
Than, it's nice to have you.
So let me step back for a second and go back to last week. Last week we said that we have, maybe I should pull up the sheet from last week. Last week we said we have three primary emotions. We have chesed, loving kindness, love. We have gevura, which is restraint, and we have tiferet, which is the blend. We didn't really speak about the blend. We'll talk about that. Love is the right side. Restraint is the left side. Respect is the left side. And then there's the middle, which we'll talk about today. So when you say true love, I agree with you that true love, a true relationship has to have all three. But the emotion of love is not the emotion of respect. They're two different emotions, and you have to have both. The emotion of love means I want to feel one with you. And when I love you and you don't see the world exactly the way I do, it's very difficult for the love to understand. Intellectually, you could. But emotionally, it's very difficult for the love to understand that.
I think it's just the
Let me finish. So the love, what the love wants to do, chesed, right side, love wants to wants to feel one. But there's a danger of wanting to feel one. What's the danger of wanting to feel one? Back to back. That it's about me, it's not really about you. So then you have a different skill. Call it love if you want to say love general, but it's a different skill. And this skill is respect. And respect is what the Zohar is saying here, separation. You know what? I love you, but we're not one. We're actually different. And it's very hard to do so with children, with spouses, very difficult thing to do. When you love your child so much, so you want your child to love baseball because when you were a kid, you loved baseball, right? So respect is a different skill. It's not the skill of love. And it's the recognition that there has to be a separation.
I think it is.
Let me finish. You have to have a separation and you have to separate. And that's the surgery. That's the one becoming apart. And it's difficult for some people to do that, easier for other people to do that, but it's understanding that the other person has a different perspective. And the key here is I don't have to agree with your perspective, but I have to respect your perspective, even respect your right to have another perspective, right? Sometimes in a relationship, any relationship, employer, employee, any relationship, one person wants to force the other person to see the world in this way, to see the problem in this way. And the other person says, I don't see that's the problem. Now, if you're my boss, you want to tell me what to do, I'll do it. But you can't force your perspective upon me. I have my own perspective. I could do what you say, but I can't. I'm entitled to my own perspective, right? So that's the point here. And that's very difficult, especially the people you love, to realize that in some sense, you're separate. So that surgery between Adam and Eve is the stage where we fell in love. We felt like we were one, but that's lonely. Then you have to separate and realize that we're actually two separate entities. And that could be painful. And then what happens is now there could be a relationship because now I see you. Now we're face to face. I could see you as something different than me, and you're not the same as me. And now we can connect and figure out how to connect. That's Tiferet. That's the third level. But that is a very important thing to understand. That we start out as one. Just like the soul, we start out as one, we separate, then we can connect. And if you start out as one, and therefore your love, and according to this, to the Kabbalah, you fall in love because you sense that you want to be one with somebody else. If you never have that point of, could we mature? Could we separate? Could we sense that we're different? Could we respect the other person's right to see things differently? Then there'll never be a true relationship. And because a true relationship is face-to-face, and face-to-face, to have two people, a relationship face-to-face would be somebody different than yourself. And we talk about, could you have a relationship with AI? So I'm not an expert in AI here, but what the point here is ultimately a relationship with myself. If I can clone myself and say, I'm so perfect, I wish I could clone myself and have a relationship with myself, right? So it's good for 5 minutes. After that, ultimately it's lonely because that person is just a reflection of myself. The whole idea of saving the person from being alone is when the person is different. But again, the challenge is that that's not natural when you're in love. When you're in love, the feeling is we are one. And the discipline is to say, on the soul level, we're one. We separate. We sense that we're different. We're two separate entities. Now, if we connect, we'll be connecting face to face, not back to back, which is far more profound and far more meaningful. So go ahead, Seth, then John, go ahead. Go ahead.
May I give you an example
Please.
which illustrates exactly what you
Please,
said?
please.
Well, for many years, I was befuddled by the Christians.
Yeah,
So I decided I will work in the Lion's Den.
yeah,
So I went to study Bible study with Christian,
yeah.
and I went to Second Congregational Church with Bob Naylor. After 2 years, they loved me there. Bob Naylor said, John, I think it take us more than 2 years to convert you. I said, Bob, I'm not here to be converted.
Right.
I'm here to become a better Jew.
Right,
And hopefully you become a better Christian. And then if I succeed in that, both win.
right.
So I said, we have to maintain our identity instead of being triumphalistic, the way the Christians say we have to convert the Jews. I'm saying, look, you have your own lens, you look, I have my own lens. How can we improve our lenses in order to, because you have some skills I don't have.
Right.
And I have some skills you don't have. And we should get together rather than saying, I'm better than you, and he says better than me, that we fight and we squander our abilities. So they continued to allow me there. They invited me at their retreats. And in fact, they had a Christian treasure hunt, and I won the first prize.
I hear you. And then you get to, but just to add one word to the discussion, is that you have oneness, then you have separation, and then you have harmony. And harmony is much deeper than oneness, because oneness means that is only my perspective.
Exactly, it's triumphalist.
Yeah.
And you don't triumphalist because the other person feels humiliated and has the need for revenge or rancor and anger and so on. On the other hand, if you give it space, the word God, humanity space, God who is true. In order to give, so you have to look at God. You follow the example of God, who is true, in order to give.
So withdrawal is the second step. Withdrawal is the fact that God creates because he wants to be one. He creates because he wants to be one with the universe. But you need that second step of saying we're separate and we're different. And we each have a different perspective, and we have fundamental disagreements with God in many different ways, spiritually speaking. And if you look at this is beyond the scope of what I meant to discuss, but if you look at the wording of the Hebrew wording, when we acknowledge God, at least from the Kabbalistic perspective, we don't necessarily say we see it the way you do. What we say is we respect your perspective. We don't necessarily accept it, but we respect your perspective, and we hope God does the same for us. Go ahead, Seth. Yeah.
My mother and I, we did not get along. She didn't like me. But I think she loved me and I loved her. And she and I, we just had completely different ways of looking at things. And it was like, I would come visit her, she didn't even come to say hello. I drove 17 hours. That's okay, I loved her. and she loved, and there were, and that was a spirit.
right,
And this is all intellect. You know, you could say, well, I respect, and this and that, but if somebody loves each other, they,
correct.
hold on, they feel it. And then when you have that feeling, you automatically will respect the other person. Because you love them so much, it automatically happens.
So
What this is doing, and I know this guy, the tiny guy.
when I, we don't have a lot of time, so I want to respond, and then after 11
You
o'clock,
have to
after
respond.
11 o'clock,
So,
after 11 o'clock, we could sit all day and debate.
Okay.
People, relationships is a very important part of our life, but people do not necessarily have the skills to manage the relationships that are very important to them. They don't necessarily, it doesn't come naturally. So I take issue with the word automatically. There are a lot of people's parents, children is a great example. A lot of people who love their children, who love their parents, and yet do not know how to manage that relationship. They have no idea. And I agree with you that essentially the love is there. Parent-child relationship, essentially the love is there. That's always, even if you don't feel it, it's concealed, it's covered, but it's there. So there is an essential bond. But essential bonds don't always help us in the practical world. And I'm going to say even more. Sometimes the fact that I love so much actually is a detrimental to the relationship. Let me.
Love is not a practice. I have to say this. I'm sorry. You don't have to like. You don't even have to.
I have the.
Love is not a practical thing.
Let me
Love
finish.
is
Seth,
beyond
11 o'clock. There's 2 minutes left.
Okay,
11 o'clock.
okay.
11 o'clock. I want to hear what you have to say. Sometimes because I love somebody so much, that actually is a detrimental to the relationship. I love you so much, so I don't like what you're doing. So I have to call you up and say, stop doing this. Either parents to children, children to parents. I'm upset at you because I love you so much. And therefore, when you're doing something different than what I pictured, then that harms our relationship. Right? So the fact that I love you so much is not going to help me be able to manage a phone call with you, because we're going to clash because we each are trying, because of our love, we're each trying to make the other person one with the person we are. And therefore, it is very important to think about the idea that there are different love, like relationship requires multiple skills. And the primary 3 skills that it requires would be the sense of oneness, sense of separation, and the sense of harmony. And if a person doesn't have all 3 and doesn't understand these 3, they don't have the most fun, my view, Kabbalistic view, they don't have the most fundamental tools of a relationship. To have a relationship for work, I have to want to be one. I have to sense that we're separate and we have the right to be separate. And then the question is, can I harmonize?
You said it, sense. You have to sense.
Yes.
It's not intellect, it's sense. And you feel, a person feels that it's okay to be separate, it's okay, all of that. And as far as the children, when saying something to the child, if a person didn't love the child, they wouldn't, if you don't care, you just say nothing. You let them jump off a bridge.
Correct.
But because somebody has a feeling for their child, they do whatever they have to do, good or bad. It may not be intellectually pleasing, but a person does what they have to do to make for that child.
Part of that is respecting that child is going to do something that is different than what I would think is good for them.
But you love the child, it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong.
Correct. But if I don't have that skill, then if I don't have that skill of respect, then the love is actually going to undermine the relationship. That is my perspective and my experience. So it's 11 o'clock. So thank you all for sticking around for the 3 weeks. I appreciate it. If anybody wants to stay on and debate, we're ready to do that. But thank you all for joining. Questions and comments, welcome. Thank you, Anna. Thank you.
Can you send the handout, please?
Can I send you?
The handout.
Yes, I'll do that. Let me see if I can do that right now. Yeah.
And did you send the other 2 or not? I'm not sure. I may have missed it.
Those 7 things are symptoms.
Did I send it? I don't think I did.
Those 7 things.
Let me I'll post it right now so you have it.
Thanks so much.
They are not, love is a feeling and something is a.
Love is not a feeling.
Yes, it is.
Love is not a feeling. You know,
We all have different
this-
opinions.
they did, what we learned from this session is that the love is, emotional. That's one.
Okay, thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Tada rabba.
It was very successful because it